Welcome to the BreakPoint podcast and our Q&A segment, Ask the Colson Center. I'm Shane Morris, host of the Upstream podcast and one of the writers for BreakPoint. I'm joined by John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center and the host of BreakPoint. Today we're answering your questions, this time about a healthy model for technology use in the home, how we keep from seeing oppression where none actually exists, and whether the modern church looks at all like the church of the New Testament. All of these questions were sparked by BreakPoint commentaries, short courses, articles, and the Colson Fellows program. If you'd like to send us a question to answer here on the podcast, all you need to do is email us. The address is askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org. The first question, John, today comes out of the Colson Fellows program, someone who has been through the program and is looking for kind of next steps, who feels very convicted about the need to engage the culture in a very intentional and systematic way. But what do you do and how do you do that? The Colson Fellows program obviously goes a long way to answering that question, but I'd love to hear your perspective and answer to a question like this. This person writes in, through the Fellows program, I now have a greater understanding that we must engage in some level of Christian activism to influence the institutions, local church, school, government, etc., that are obviously broken. Is there any process or technique that can be used as a guide to begin this engagement? Any group or organization besides Colson Center that does this well?
Yeah, there's tons of groups that do it well, far more than we give credit for. Several years ago, when Sean McDowell and I wrote the book on same-sex marriage, it was kind of a depressing write because we could see the handwriting on the wall. We could see, where this thing was going. This was before Obergefell. I was challenged to write by another friend, Warren Smith, who used to work with us at the Colson Center, about, what good things are happening in the world, kind of that Mr. Rogers, whenever there's a calamity, look for the helpers. And that extended into really looking at 14 or 15 different areas of culture and telling 4 or 5 stories in each area of Christians doing remarkably good things. There was 2 reasons for that. Number one is to show that there were a lot of groups doing good things. And the second reason is because these were people that weren't kind of famous Christians, if you know what I mean. It's easier to read biographies of Wilberforce or Bonhoeffer or others and say, well, they were great men and I'm not a great man. It's kind of the great man excuse, And this was a way of saying, look, you don't know any of these people, these men and women and children and visionary leaders who are doing unbelievably important things. And I kind of felt like Elijah after Mount Carmel. We ran out into the wilderness and started to pout. He said, I'm the only one, and God showed up and was like, you have no idea what you're talking about. I had no idea, even though, this is what I do for a living. I had no idea until writing that book, just kind of how diverse these efforts were, whether you're talking about trying to restore elementary education or dealing with victims of pornography or addictions or, working to take care of children. One of the most remarkable stories had to do with a group of Christian women who lived near the Supermax prison, and there's a whole bunch of prisons not too far from here in Colorado, and there's women who go to prison who are pregnant. Well, they can't have their kids with them, so what happens to their children? They can't visit them. These are Christian women that live nearby and run essentially a care home to take care of these children, to keep the relational connection between mom and child as much as possible during that incarceration, and then to actually offer challenges and almost like a halfway house for these moms to learn how to mom, in a sense, before they're released. It's amazing. And it fits into a framework. And so when you ask about the process or the technique, look, this is the model. It's don't think about all the things you can't do. Realize that God put you in a time and place and the influence that you have, and then start asking questions. What's good here? Because one of the ways we can actually influence a culture, whether it's a home culture, a school culture, a neighborhood culture, or Western culture, is to highlight and emphasize the good. Hold it up. What's missing that can be contributed? When it comes to the way that abject poverty was dealt with for a long time, the focus was answering that question wrong. You know what's missing? Money. You know what they need? Money. But the problem is we realized the more money we threw at abject poverty, the worse abject poverty got. What needed to be thrown at it were not just money, but dignity and resources and rule of law and protections and that sort of stuff. It reminds me of the guy that's doing remarkable work on homelessness in Austin, Texas, with tiny homes. He's like, the problem is people think that homelessness is the loss of a home. Homelessness is actually the catastrophic loss of relationships. What a brilliant idea. You throw a home at someone who's homeless, that may not solve the problem. If you throw relationships at someone who is suffering a catastrophic loss of relationships, now you can actually move the needle. So what's good, what's missing, what's evil that we can resist, and what's broken that we can restore? And, in that front, when you start looking around, and again, I'll point you to the Mr. Rogers idea, look for the helpers. It doesn't mean that everyone's doing it well. And this is one of the hardest things we deal with, Shane, is I come across stories of people doing remarkable things, and we don't agree on a whole bunch of stuff. Maybe we agree on Jesus, maybe we agree on the Bible, maybe we agree on your salvation, but, maybe we disagree on gender and marriage and that sort of stuff. And it's hard because I want to say, look at what they're doing here and saying the reason that this works is because they're doing it biblically. And by the way, their thinking is wrong over here. And we've got to be able to parse those things out. There's even going to be cases where I look at non-Christian organizations or not explicitly Christian organizations that are right because all truth is God's truth. And if they're right about how they're dealing with a particular problem or advancing a particular good, it's because of natural revelation. It's because of common grace, because we live in the same world, that is created by God and that has rules. And it's okay to hold that. But the good news is listen, God has his Christians everywhere doing everything. Every year at Wilberforce Weekend, we try to highlight some of these. I'll give you an example for this coming year. We've rolled out all the speakers. You can go to wilberforceweekend.org. I'm really excited because I'm going to talk about redeemed life. We're going to hit for the first time we've done in Wilberforce sports. Because there's this guy, I've known this guy for a long time. He was actually my college basketball coach. He's known affectionately by NBA superstars and by at least one former janitor at a small community college in rural Virginia as Coach Mo. He's known by former players who weren't good enough to play at really good programs. We played, at a small little college and had a lot of fun, like me. And people at the top of the game right now in the world, literally, affectionately, is Coach Mo. Coach Mo is placed by God in a particular place to help bring light, truth, faith, goodness into a complicated space, which is sport. And a space that's only getting more complicated the more confused we are about what it means to be human and what it means to be boy and girl and everything else. God has Coach Mo in an amazing place, and I've traveled with him across the Southeast. He treats people that he meets at rest stops and people that he meets at the NBA on TNT studios the same. It's going to be cool. So that's an example. There's people. God has his people everywhere, because ultimately, if anything's being restored, if anything's being forgiven, if anything's being really advanced, that's good. God's doing that work, and we're just joining in anyway.
Andrew Peterson has this great remark in his book, Adorning the Dark, where he quotes Samwise Gamgee in The Lord of the Rings, and he talks about tending your own little patch of garden and how that's kind of Sam's dream. That's his idea of the good life. And he connects it to our calling and how in our 70 years on this earth, we can only do so much. We can only devote our resources, our time, our energy, our intelligence, our families to so much task before it's all done. And when we tackle a question like, what's the next step? What is the system for influencing institutions, so the church, school, government, that are obviously broken? I think we have to be very, very careful with where we set our targets and how broad our target area is. We as individuals, like Chuck used to say, or like the sign on his desk used to say, are called to faithfulness, not success. And often, especially in a hyper-connected age, we can look at all these institutions arrayed in all of their, I won't say majesty, in all of their tragedy, and think, my goodness, what a task. What can little old me do to change this world, to turn all these massive ships around? It's going to take so long. And I don't think we're called to that. And that was Andrew's point. It sounds like the kind of the attitude that Coach Mo has and the folks that you're talking about, where we're called to a very particular and limited space in which God expects us to be faithful and use our talents and resources and mental capacity and so forth to glorify him. And we're not actually called to turn institutions around single-handedly. I think we're called just to do the right thing where we are in a judicious and careful way, and then to leave the results in God's hands. That was something that was a lot easier to do in past times when our circle of daily contacts and influence was much smaller and more local, because we could see the difference we were making in our local area because we were looking at those people and those institutions and those, school boards and those libraries and those homeschool co-ops or whatever the case happened to be. Now we look at things in such a macro level, or at least I find that I do, that it becomes paralyzing. There's a feeling of hopelessness that what could I possibly do to influence this nation? Or what can I possibly do to fix the issue in Ukraine? Or what could I possibly do to reverse the undefining of gender and sex and the victimization that happens to children as a result in this country? Well, what if you're not called to reverse those things single-handedly? What if God is actually big enough to fulfill his purposes in his way, and all he calls you to do is be faithful with what you've got and tend your little patch of earth? That's the question that it sounds to me like this listener is asking, what the Colson Fellows program asks, and then what many of these organizations and individuals you mentioned are answering in their own way, and then looking at the results in that macro, personal, low altitude level and being satisfied with what you see there. That's a skill we need to cultivate. Otherwise, I think the task becomes impossible. You can't really engage the culture in a nebulous way. You have to define that, right? You have to actually engage some piece of culture, some set of individuals, some organization, some responsibility in your own life that you can actually work on. So I have a very abstract mind, and I tend to think in abstract terms and look at those abstract problems and get daunted by them. But I hope that these answers direct this listener and others to getting specific and getting intentional about tending that patch of earth instead of getting lost in the size of the problems. Well, speaking of sizable problems, the next question has to do with the modern church and whether and how it has lost its way, specifically whether it looks anything like the church of the New Testament. This listener writes in, your post on what church is really like was interesting, but didn't deal with the core problem of church. I've seen the church as a system, a business, and not much more than a social club. The model of church in America, at least, is not biblical, where it's more or less a one-person dog and pony show. Nowhere in the Bible can I find this model. Can you speak to the model of the modern church? I'm sure we've gotten here by a totally logical road, but it seems like what we're doing now isn't biblical, and I struggle to want to be a part of it.
Well, I understand the frustration. A lot of people have that frustration. I don't know what, though, it means by what we're doing now isn't biblical. I mean, what do we mean by we? Like every church in America today, every church in one particular city? I don't know where this listener comes from, or around the world. I mean, there's two things to remember as someone who has also been guilty of being critical of the church, and I think oftentimes for good reasons. The first thing is that there's never been a perfect age of the church. Sometimes people will read the Bible and say, let's go back to the New Testament church. Like, which one? The New Testament church. And, the early New Testament church, there was a whole lot of things that they hadn't figured out yet. First of all, what it looks like to do church in a place where you're not persecuted for it, what it looks like to be a church where you are really persecuted for it, what it looks like to do a church that's figured out things like the canon and the Trinity and Sunday school. These are developments in the history of the church, and that's okay. What is the ancient church? Is it the church at Corinth? Because Paul certainly wasn't really happy with those guys.
You've got a list of churches in Revelation you could pick from.
Yeah, right. You kind of look at the 7 churches in Revelation, and that batted less than 500 too. So, in other words, there hasn't been a golden age or a perfect age of the church. Here's why: the church is made up of people, and people are flawed, and there's always power struggle, and there's always confusion. Paul says this. He goes, you got people over here doing this and people over here doing this. And here's what he says. He goes, but you know what? The gospel is being preached, and that's what it's all about. And the one thing we know that is true about God is that when he wants to speak, he does. And when he wants to move, he will. And our best efforts to get in his way are futile, because God gets what he wants. And apparently what God wanted to do is build the church. Jesus said as much. The gates of hell aren't going to be able to stand against it. didn't make me any less critical of the church, but made me a much bigger fan of the church, was studying church history. And I've said this before, it's because church history is so crazy and broken and weird that at the end you're like, man, God must really be behind this, because there's no other logical, rational explanation for its ongoing survival, much less success. But think of the success. Think of how many things in the world has changed because of the church and the influence of the church, and yet it's never had a golden age. Now, this is not to say that we don't have distinct, real problems today. Absolutely, we have distinct, real problems today. And one of them is what this guy talked about, a one-person dog and pony show. There is examples of the church right now that is centered around personalities, celebrities, individuals. And those things have been a mix of being very problematic. Sometimes it's because the celebrity pastor person themselves are actually seeking that sort of quote unquote platform. Sometimes it's just because we live in a celebrity driven age and people get elevated to that. So I understand what's being said here. But you know what? There's also a lot of churches that go by the name Christian that don't have a celebrity pastor, and they've got their problems too. I've said before, I think one of the fundamental issues in our church is that we have turned it from a go and tell model to a come and see model. And that is a line that I owe to T.M. Moore, who used to work with the Colson Center and a longtime theological friend and advisor of Chuck Colson. Is the whole motto is you come in the church to get equipped, and then the people get sent out. It's a go and tell, a go and proclaim model. Now it's, hey, come and see our architecture, come and see our worship band, come and see our really great speaker. And I think that's a fundamental flaw. And yet at the same time, it's our flaw. There's not a perfect age in the history of the church. And I was chastened several years ago by a colleague, because it's really easy when you do the sort of work that we do to get cynical, particularly to ourselves. One of the points of that column was that Christians are quick to believe all the worst news about ourselves and then to beat ourselves in public. I'm not saying we shouldn't repent, we shouldn't confess, we shouldn't acknowledge the things that are wrong. Of course we should, and we should do it publicly, and we should do it with humility. But it's not a virtue to just believe every rumor about ourselves and to speak badly about each other. This is one of my issues right now with some of the more vocal public spokespeople that are getting a lot of traction in various areas of culture, is that they really make their living by talking about how bad we are. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're not. But church is the bride of Christ. And this colleague of mine chasing me by saying, you might want to be careful because that's God's bride. And you know what? We understand that the bride, what's that wonderful line from the hymn, the church is one foundation, about, this is an ugly bride, but it's still God's bride. It's still the bride of Christ. You talk about my bride, I'm going to punch you in the face. You talk negatively about my bride, it's I choose her every time. I feel like that's my job. Mm-hmm. Not because she's always perfect. Not because she maybe is never wrong in an interaction, but, and his point was, you might want to be careful because you're actually talking about Christ's bride. He might get grumpy about that too. And I think that there's a point there, where there is, Scripture talks about, be kind to everyone, but especially those of the household of faith. We need to be critics from the inside, not critics from the outside. We need to be critics without being cynics. We need to chasten without losing our love. I'm not sure we're doing that all the time when we talk about church. And you're right, we didn't get to all of that in that commentary. That's my other beef that I share with my friend Ed Stetzer. I can't say everything in one commentary. It's just not possible. There's a whole bunch of them. I'm sure we've said these other things in other places, but you can't always cover dot all the I's and cross all the T's.
Here's a follow-up question then, John. How do you approach church leadership, pastors, elders, what have you, when you see something that needs correcting, addressing, attention, or rebuke, but you don't want to contribute to the sort of pile-on against the church? You don't want to be insulting Christ's bride, but you also want to be a good custodian and keeper. What is the approach there for, say, a lay person who, either works in a ministry like this, or maybe just works at a regular job?
I think it's a good question. I think number one is to have a good bit of discernment. In other words, let's really discern between what is a core gospel issue, a core issue of truth, and what doesn't matter of preference or inference. So, for example, having a different set of priorities, within the church about this ministry needs to be done or that needs to be addressed, it may not be an issue of faithfulness. It may be an issue of priorities, and it may be an issue of limited resources. It may be an issue of, this is what I know to really care about, and, that sort of thing. So I think that level of discernment takes care of about 70% of the grumpiness in church. It doesn't mean that your priorities aren't better than your pastor's priorities. It just means that there is a respect that God has given him the stewardship over that body, not you. And there's a level of respect. You and I spent a lot of time talking about this, and we spent a lot of time talking about this during the pandemic. I think that there were some ridiculous things that took place during the pandemic, our reaction to it. It showed that we were more concerned about fearing things that we shouldn't fear, things like that. But if you're going to leave a church, it better be about more than masks. That's all I'm saying. Trust me. Anyone that has hung out with me knows that I have opinions about these things. But you're talking about family, And I just think questioning priorities is the very, very first place to start and say, look, is this a make or break issue or not? Or is this a pet issue? The number of times we will take a pet issue and turn it into a make or break issue, and it's just not legitimate. And I think seek counsel on that so you know the difference. The second thing is going with an amount of grace to the pastor. Because we are so shaped by consumerism, we treat this as a product. So we treat talking to the pastor like we would talking to the manager at Starbucks because we got the wrong drink order. I don't think we talk to each other like brothers and sisters. I'm stunned sometimes. And look, I've got friends. I love that they engage with BreakPoint and the Colson Center, and I still consider them friends. And yet they'll disagree with something I say, and they'll post on Facebook, and you're like, did you just say that about me? Like, me. Like, we have hung out. And it's like, Stone Street's drunk the liberal Kool-Aid. And I'm like, what are you talking? I mean, it's just hilarious. And I don't care. Honestly, I have pretty thick skin as part of the gig. But I just think, we need to cut each other a little bit more slack than this. We need to, give each other a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt, because this is part of what it means to complain as an insider, not as an outsider. So first, discernment. Second, grace. Third, and this is huge, and my wife's really good at this, because she runs our Colson Fellows cohort here in town, and she also runs 3 other things. And so people will come to her with here's what you should do. And we always joke about how, God loved us and Chuck had a wonderful plan for our lives. But we know those people that have a wonderful plan for our lives. They're like, here's what you need to do to make this better. And my wife's really good at going, yeah, what's your plan, to make a difference here? In other words, it's like, if this is what you are convinced needs to change, there's a big difference between going to the pastor and saying, hey, I'd like to try this, or I think this is important, and here's a resource that I'm going to actually, do, or, we need to spend $1 million on carpet, and here's the $1 million, and going and saying, here's what you need to do, and if you don't do it, you're not being faithful. So a lot of times that discernment, that grace, and that generosity with time and solution fit together. Because if you're going with a you're not serving me attitude, now, again, I'm not saying that there's not real issues. I'm just saying you go through the 3 steps and suddenly our list of issues gets cut in half or more. I'm just convinced, if you're not going to the pastor with an attitude to serve, we tell our Colson Fellows that. It's a dangerous thing to really learn something new and be convinced that it's as important as possible, because it's easy to go back and complain that everybody else hasn't realized the same thing you've realized. We joke about the new Calvinist, right? He becomes a Calvinist. He needs to be locked in a closet for 2 years until he gets over himself. We talk about the new Colson Fellow, and we're like, hey, this is hugely important, but don't go to your pastor and tell him all the things that he's doing wrong. Go to your pastor and say, how can I serve? Here's an idea to serve. Is that okay? So listen, be discerning on whether we're talking about a really important thing or not an important thing, or to what degree it's an important thing. Be gracious and not, assuming that your pastor is a heretic because, he doesn't have the same priorities as you, even if he should. And then third, go with solutions. Don't just go with a problem. Go with service, not just go with demands. I think those are 3 really good places to start.
That's fantastic. I could really hear your heart in that one, John. It sounds like you've had conversations with a lot of pastors and perhaps have a little bit of kinship with them because of the overlap of, leading an organization like the Colson Center and leading a local church. You get a lot of those complaints and you deal with a lot of those same kinds of demands. And
being a pastor is a hard job. You get hired for one thing and fired for something else. That's always a hard place to be. You get hired to preach the gospel and make disciples, and you get fired because there's not enough butts in the seats. This is really hard. Or what do they call it? Noses and nickels. That's probably a nicer word. Not enough noses and nickels. But that's not to say that there's not, issues. Again, we talked about earlier this week on a BreakPoint commentary, Maria and I talked about, a lot of pastors are unwilling to tackle these really difficult issues having to do with artificial reproductive technology because they wrongly assume one of two things, that it's not relevant to their congregation and there's nothing more relevant to their congregation, or that it's not worth the risk. And then you got to say, well, what's at risk? What's at risk are actual babies' lives. It's worth the risk. You got to say what you got to say. But man, I always think of that quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, all truths are bloody truths to me. And boy, that is the state of public discourse right now. All truths are bloody truths. Like we are fighting and bleeding over everything. And I just don't think that's Christian at all.
Well, thanks for that. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this to answer more of your questions. Stay with us.
In a world of nonstop headlines, many Christians are looking for the right way to seek God faithfully. We don't just want to read the news, we want to have an impact. What if the solution was as straightforward as simply praying together? To some, this feels way too easy. There's always a danger of talking about prayer, but never actually doing it. It's easy to post a quick thoughts and prayers on someone's Facebook wall when we don't know what else to say. When Christians do that, we let one of the most powerful practices of Christian discipline sink to the level of cliche. But with loneliness at historic levels, there's a widespread sense of purposelessness, a cynicism among young people. Many are deconstructing elements of their faith that they've previously taken for granted and are desperate to see the Christian life lived out well. They just don't know where to turn to. Likewise, older Christians are eager to pour into the next generation, but they feel like it's easy to get stuck. All of us are wrestling with the ways that religion has been privatized in our modern world, soiled off by generations, or relegated to a superficial hello on Sunday mornings. But prayer speaks to each of these cultural flashpoints. It's so much more than simply just a way for us to connect with God privately. It's where we bare our hearts and turn to Him in community. Oswald Chambers once wrote that prayer does not fit us for a greater work. Prayer is the greater work. And that's why at the Colson Center during the season of Lent, we are offering a time of guided prayer. We're calling it Pray With Me. It centers on Tony Sauter's book, The Pray For Me campaign, that seeks to bridge the generational gap with prayer. We invite you to these inspiring and encouraging times where friends of the Colson Center share some of the ways that prayer has impacted them and encourage us not only to engage our community, but to engage our community with prayer. John opens the time in a special prayer for us each week, and these friends of the Colson Center share their thoughts and also lead us in prayer. And all of that's bookended by a special time of music with our friend Josh Bales. We want to invite you to sign up for these times of guided prayer. You can sign up and participate online, live, every Wednesday, or we will email you recordings of the time where you can watch at your leisure. To join us in this time of guided prayer, simply visit breakpoint.org/pray for me. Again, that's breakpoint.org/pray for me.
We are back here on the BreakPoint podcast and our Q&A segment, Ask the Colson Center, answering your questions from a Christian worldview perspective. The next question is a wonderful bit of introspection and a wonderful bit of caution when it comes to how do you identify oppression and keep from creating the sense of oppression through suggestion. If that doesn't make sense, let me read the question. From your commentary on trigger warnings, I wanted to ask you a question. I'm of the opinion that if people you trust tell you you are systematically oppressed, whether that's true or not, you will see oppression where none exists. There's a danger where I think we hear from people that they're oppressed, but we don't actually recognize their oppression because we think it's self-described or self-induced. And in that, there can be a priest in the Good Samaritan stories. How should we approach this cultural moment where it feels like everyone is triggered and nearly everyone says they're oppressed? And let me take a brief stab at sort of paraphrasing this question. How do we, on the one hand, keep from inducing oppression by suggesting there's oppression? And then on the other hand, how do we keep from indulging the tendency of induced oppression? And then on the other hand, how do we keep from ignoring real oppression and ascribing it to this sort of suggestion?
Yeah. Boy, I tell you, if the Bible is to you a collection of random text of good advice to have a happier life or a moral life, you're not going to be able to tell the difference. The only way to be able to navigate these kind of walk and chew gum things that we are dealing with on so many different areas is to have a foundation that goes back bigger than the cultural moment we're in. The cultural moment we're in is like a game of whiplash. Like, this is an oppression, this is an oppression, this is a problem, that's a problem. What I love about Scripture is that it offers the larger story to contain the moment. Sometimes when I'm speaking to students, I'll talk about the Lord of the Rings and saying, what if I told you that I stopped reading the books when Gandalf, fell off that bridge and that mountain? And you'd be like, wait a minute, that's not the whole story. And sometimes I feel like we're looking at questions of justice and truth and morality and goodness and beauty and everything else from this moment and forgetting that this moment's part of a larger story. The only way you can define right and wrong is if there's something outside of ourselves to define right and wrong. The only way you can define justice is if there is actually a sense of justice. Lewis says, the only way you know a line's crooked is if you know what a straight line is. It's such an important point, isn't it? That the only way to do this is from a Christian worldview. And what I mean by a Christian worldview is a larger story of reality that the Bible offers that tells us what is real, what is true, where history is headed, what's wrong with the world, how it's going to be fixed, and who we are. We've mentioned a couple times this framework of content that we've developed over the last several months. And really, it starts with the story, what is true and what is real, and goes to the human person. Who am I? And then it goes to mission. How should we live? And you don't do the how should we live, like what should I be mad at, if you don't start with what is true and what is real. Because otherwise you're mad at inconvenience or you're taking on somebody else's offense. I mean, we get a lot of emails telling us who we should be mad at, don't we? The only way to navigate these things is to start by going, this is what's true. I get a lot of emails telling me what Chuck Colson would have done about some particular political issue. Maybe he would have, but as much as I'm grateful and build and aim this organization and all of our content in the direction where I think Chuck pointed us, the more important question is what is true and what is good and what is real. And that's what Chuck talked about. You can still hear that raspy voice going, truth, we need truth, and because we need truth. We don't need WWCD, we need, WWGD. What did God do? That acronym broke down, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
The idea here is there's no way to tell the difference on these things unless you have a fixed reference point. The reason we're so quick to take up somebody else's offense or to dismiss somebody else's offense is because we're like the person trying to navigate their way out of the woods with a compass that always points at them. If you don't have a fixed reference point, I've been thinking a lot about this, Shane. I actually wrote this down in Sunday school yesterday when I hope my pastor isn't paying attention, isn't listening here, but I kind of got mentally on a rabbit trail as he was talking about Francis Schaeffer, which is really good. I haven't really thought about Francis Schaeffer in a long time, but I was thinking about how Francis Schaeffer talked about the crisis of truth and the crisis of morality. and that we had a catastrophic loss of truth, right? That was, he is there, escape from reason, some of those things, and a catastrophic loss of morality. He was talking about how, the Romantics, if you look at how then should we live, and just kind of the history of how we lost our way. He was talking about morality and truth, and obviously those are still the case. But now that's expanded to a catastrophic loss in relationship, and a catastrophic loss in meaning, and a catastrophic loss of identity. In other words, there's just no fixed reference point. And so that's why it's so easy to be bounced around by different people and to find ourselves playing the self-righteous priest or, the person who beat up the Samaritan, because there's not a fixed reference point. There's no way forward for the church missionally in this cultural moment than to get that fixed reference point clarified again.
The next question draws into the conversation on this question in terms of seeing where oppression and systemic racism are extant. And, honestly, John, I'm kind of surprised at the volume of listeners and readers who are thinking about this continually. This is something that is clearly, it's part of the cultural debate right now in a way that's very sustained. And we're talking not in terms of, how do you treat people so much as what are our core principles? What are the things we actually believe about the definitions of words, about the reality of these types of sin and what level they occur. So this person asks, our institutions have failed so many, yet many just ignore them because it doesn't affect them directly. At one time, there was anti-Irish sentiment and anti-Catholic sentiment in America, but that's disappeared. Yet there is still racism, and those who say that racism either doesn't exist or you can't legislate it away. Can you help me understand why we don't see the anti-Irish and anti-Catholic sentiment, for example, yet racism against African Americans and Asians and Hispanics is still present?
I don't know. I'm sure there's a lot of historical forces, and some people other than I could probably walk through that. But I do think we see partiality beyond just the racial one. And here's why. The current narrative, for example, is that the source of racism against African Americans, Asian, and Hispanics is all the same, and that's whiteness. The fact of the matter is, on the ground, is that there is racism between African Americans and Asians, and between Hispanics and African Americans, and between Caucasians and everybody else. And I mean on a personal level, and yet it's way better on a personal level than it's been in many communities. And it's not in other communities. And you might not have anti-Catholic and anti-Irish sentiment, although I could take you to a couple of necks of the woods and find you some anti-Catholic sentiment pretty quickly. I can find you anti-Southern sentiment. I can find you anti-Christian sentiment. I can find you anti-male sentiment and anti-female sentiment in response. In other words, I'm not saying that racism doesn't exist, but I'm saying that racism itself is an expression of a deeper sin that the Bible calls partiality. And that idea of partiality is not unrelated to race, but it's not fundamentally rooted in race. It's fundamentally rooted in our capacity after the fall to dehumanize one another. In the cultural context that we live in, which is influenced, by ideas and by dominant ethnicities and all kinds of different things. And certainly financial situations do this, because there's always partiality, by the way, between rich and poor. That's something that Paul talks about in Corinth. We continue to see today, whether we're talking about the rich people who wanted to fund the police and pay for their own police in their own neighborhoods, or whether we're talking about the reverse of that, where those in impoverished neighborhoods hate wealthy people because they're wealthy. Our tendency to dehumanize another takes all kinds of different forms. And in certain cultural moments with all kinds of cultural forces at play, then it moves into one direction or another. That's why I think that racial narrative is certainly part of it. And it's because there's this whole history that has shaped it. And that history persists in some parts of the country. It really does. But it's also a form of this to say, well, the only people that are ever guilty of racism is this. You're missing that this sin of partiality is something that exists across the board. And in certain times, in certain places, in certain cultural moments, even if those cultural moments last over the span of several decades, or even beyond, like we have on some issues, it's still just not about skin color or ethnicity. We will find ways to dehumanize other people any and every way we possibly can. It's just what we do.
Well, on our whirlwind of subjects today, we're moving now to technology use and how we wisely navigate the array of choices and channels and devices that vie for our attention. This person wants to know, is there a healthy model for technology use with teens? I feel like they need to have it, especially for schooling and the like, but I can't get around the fact that when I was a kid, my nose was in a book the majority of every day. When my kids are in front of technology, it just feels so different. Can you help me understand why this is and what some resources might be to help me think well for technology use in our family?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important thing to remember that books were technology too. I know we don't think of books as technology, but at one point that was a new technology, the printed word put together, and it changed the world and it brought about really good things.
Back in my day, we had to use scrolls. We had to unroll them all the way across the room.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And everything was written backwards. Yeah, I mean, there's technology has done this to us. And that doesn't mean that all technology is equally good or equally bad or it doesn't change things.
I used to think that. I used to have that attitude, John, that that all technology is just morally neutral and that it doesn't really tend in any direction at all. I don't think that anymore.
The medium is the message. And it's always been the case.
Yeah.
Neil Postman talks about the newspaper and that one of the things the newspaper did is that it gave everyone the impression that staying informed was actually doing something. So you could be informed about a tragedy halfway around the world and not care about what happened to your neighbor last night, and that was a very real thing. It's a part of technology. Some people would say you got your nose in a book all day. You don't know how to fish, run a trot line, or, skin a deer that you just killed. That's what reading books will do for you. You don't know how to work for a living. You hear these sorts of things about every technology. All that to say, our current digital technologies, which I know is the question, has some real challenges. Challenges because we live in a cultural moment of a loss of identity, a loss of relationship, and a loss of meaning. So in certain cultural contexts, these technologies will take on different challenges, especially, a context like ours where you have a weakened family unit, then the impact of technology is escalated. And there's challenges in and of technology itself, right? Something that's fully immersive versus something that just deals with one of your sentences, something that can give you a false sense of reality when there's real reality right next door. So, yeah, I think a lot of people have thought about this and they thought about it helpful. So I'm just going to point you to 3 places. I think these are the 3 most helpful people that I know of on this topic. The first is Sherry Turkle. Her last name is like turtle, but with a K, has been writing and studying on technology and what it does to us for a long time. She's at MIT. She's not a believer. So if you want to engage her stuff, I'll give you 2 points, 2 places. Number 1 is her book, Alone Together, and her more recent book, which I can't remember the title. Alone Together is talking about some of the challenges unique to this kind of technology. And then the new book is talking about how you can actually continue to structure and build relationships in this context. She's not a Luddite. She doesn't think technology is going away. So she's trying to give strategies for getting around that. Very simple things like, for example, she talks about sacred space. Have some tech-free areas of your life. If you want the initial point of this to decide whether or not you want to buy the book, look up her TED Talks. She's got 2 that I know of. She may have done more since then. But Sherry Turkle on the TED Talks, just really good. So that's number 1. Number 2 is Andy Crouch. Andy Crouch has a book called The Tech-Wise Family, and he talks about this in the context of technology as a family. I think it's really great. Also gets to some really good strategies there. The third source is Kathy Cook. Dr. Kathy, the CEO of Celebrate Kids, her book is called Screens and Teens. What I really like about this book is that she goes through very carefully 5 lies that digital technology tells us about ourselves and the world. So in other words, it's not just that like, when I was young, I was in a book. It's like, oh no, this kind of technology gives you the impression that you're the center of reality. Mm-hmm. This kind of technology gives you the impression that you deserve whatever reality you want.
Yeah.
And she walks through these 5 lies. And I just, by the way, framed these lies a little bit differently. But, she talks about living in an age where you don't like who is at the party, you can crop them out and you can crop whoever you wish were at the party into it. And you know what? You don't have to buy the whole album. You actually can just buy one song. In other words, you remember those old days, those difficult days of the pioneers when, you had to get the whole roll of film developed. Now you can delete this one, select this one, and then enlarge it and then add color, give the girl a tan or whatever. And you can make the picture look exactly like you want it to look. That tells you something about who you are and about the world you live in. And I think, especially when you're talking about students, to have some language for those 5 lies, and then how you can actually think about overcoming those lies. I found that book to be really helpful. So Sherry Turkle, Andy Crouch, Kathy Cook.
You know what I've learned in just observing this issue in my own family's life, in the lives of other families, and then reading about it, sort of absorbing the experiences of other parents, is that modern digital technology has a uniquely distorting power that something like, books, even if they were just trashy books, just like not dirty, but just worthless books, frivolous, that they never had. And that's because when kids are growing up, between the moment they begin to really perceive the world around them and walk all the way to the moment when they begin to get out on their own and become adults, they're developing a sort of operating system as human beings, to use a technological analogy. And they're learning how their life works, how their relationships work, what it means to use your body in the right way, to better the lives of others, to stay healthy mentally and physically. All the various milestones that go into developing as a human being, to learning how to do this, are happening in that space of time. And when you lay over top of that the learning process for a different operating system, the operating system of learning how to live as a disembodied mind and an avatar on the internet, where you're represented to people who you never actually physically interact with, that can have a tremendously distorting influence on their development. I've seen it again and again, where you are learning how to be something other than what you actually are. And that's part of the power of it. And even if we disregard the content of the technology and the communication, even if we don't factor in pornography or internet harassment or just the nastiness that is Twitter, or the exposure to all kinds of ideas, worldviews, and manipulative influences that happens in a place like, we'll say, Tumblr, even if you don't think about the content, the medium itself has the power to make kids reimagine what it is to be human. And so that by itself is an impetus. And I think this is what Sherry Turkle especially really gets at. That in itself can be an opportunity and a motivation to become a different kind of person than what previous generations became. And that's why something like a sacred space is important, because what you're doing in family life together, when you sit down, you have conversations face to face, when you have a dinner or something like that, the reason she views those as moments that need to be protected from screens for a while is not because screens are necessarily bad, but because those are the moments when you are being trained in how to be a human being. That's when you're learning the human operating system. And if you are overlaying something else on top of that, you're learning how to be, quite simply, something other than human. That's been really pounded home to me. And it's reminded me that as I raise my kids, I can't let them begin to learn some other way of being in the midst of the very moments when they're supposed to be learning how to be little humans. And it's easy for me to forget because I didn't grow up like that. I had screens, but I didn't grow up in the ubiquity of digital engagement, entertainment that they have. I didn't grow up with one of these in my pocket, this only several inches across screen that constantly begs and begs and begs for your attention and makes noises and vibrates to ask for your attention. All of those are influences I didn't have to deal with. And so that's, to me, that is the conviction that I've come to regarding the medium itself, not even thinking about the message at all. And why I think this is a really important question to ask, and not at all a Luddite question. This isn't an anti-technology question, but the concern is real. And I think those resources you recommended are going to be really helpful for this listener and potentially others. So thank you. Well, that's all the time we've got for today, folks. Thanks so much for listening to the BreakPoint podcast and our Q&A segment, Ask the Colson Center. If you've got a question you'd like us to answer here on the program, please send that in to us. The address is askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org. For John Stone Street and the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. We'll see you next week.